So I'm really excited to do this church leader tour with Bishop Bill Gohl. And Bill and I are actually sitting in the same room. A lot of times I'm just talking to somebody on Skype. So, Bill, I wanted to ask you about a topic that you have come out in your first year or first 11 months as bishop, talking about the multiracial church and racism. And I want to ask you some more about that. But I guess the first question I want to ask is, why is that such a passion for you?
Sure. I grew up in the Metropolitan New York Synod, which is a very ethnic and immigration status diverse area, in that people have a long memory of where they come from and the gifts that they bring, the cultural traditions that they bring. But we're surrounded by folk who are still coming. And for an immigrant church like the Lutheran Church, that always made for interesting potluck suppers, at least in a more metropolitan area. Well, our synod is a metropolitan area, and it's not just Baltimore. Delaware is part of the Philadelphia metroplex at the top. A lot of retirees from the Baltimore-Washington metroplex at the south, and now with Frederick and the Route 70 corridor becoming more of a bedroom community, that's more and more a part of the Baltimore-Washington metroplex as well. And we're seeing pockets of ethnic diversity in places that are just surprising. And our churches are unprepared not only to reach out, but to welcome people of different cultures, having forgotten that immigrant spirit of a generation or maybe two or three gone by. A funny example of that is Zion Church at City Hall Plaza, our historic mother German church in Baltimore City, still worships in the German language every week at their early service. And what surprised me on a recent visit to Zion Church is that if you go to both the German service and the English service, the German service is becoming increasingly younger. And it's not just people from Germany, although it is some people from Germany and their families, but people from Argentina, people from the German language school, people from the colleges who are coming out to experience a different culture within their own community. But more than that experience of growing up with multicultural, multiracial community and congregations, my own sense of deep and abiding faith in the Word of God, it speaks to me about this particular topic and issue for the church. Some people might remember at my installation as bishop of our synod, the presiding bishop referenced my confirmation verse from Isaiah 58:12. You should be called the repairer of the breach and restorer of the streets to dwell in. And for me, that always speaks of community, of what it means to be neighbor in a world that's afraid of the neighbors. And I think the breach used to be, between people of different cultures. Now the breach is the street that runs in front of our home and the person on the other side of the home. And then in our congregations, the breach is, the parking lot and the street that runs around the church, because people are still driving in and, but the neighbors are not wandering over. The church is not the center of community anymore, because we're so westernized and we've become so attached to so many other activities and gadgets and technologies and what have you. But people of different cultures are continuing to flood our communities. And the church can be and should be a place of safety and welcome, a place where people can come and create a new sense of community in a foreign land. Isaiah speaks to this over and over again. In Isaiah 56, God says, my house should be called a house of prayer for all people. And yet when you go and visit so many of our congregations, they reflect a particular generation or ethnic community, but the neighborhoods around them are often changing. And some people say, well, that's an urban thing or a rural thing. Some of our most ethnically diverse congregations are out in the middle of cornfields, in open farmland. We can't just say that ethnic diversity, racial justice, that these things are a Baltimore thing, because they're a Wilmington thing. and they're an Odessa thing, and they're an Annapolis thing, and they're a Frederick thing, and a Hagerstown thing, and a Cumberland thing, and all of those places in between. So my passion comes from believing that our church and its theological richness has something to offer as a safe place of welcome for those who are coming into our communities through immigration, but also in an increasingly interracial sense of family and community and school and work and play that's happening so much in the world around us, but doesn't happen, at least naturally, in many of our churches.
Well, that is a great lead-in then to the next question, and the one that that really intrigued me both personally and larger for the Synod. You made the comment at this past year's Synod Assembly that the congregations that you've served have become more racially diverse while you were there. And I leaned in on that comment, and the question I wanted to ask is, how? How did that happen? Because I want that for my congregation, and I want that for all of our congregations.
Sure, I think that's a really fine question, and I want to begin by saying there is no magic bullet. There is no magic potion, there is no magic wand. It's hard work. Building community, especially a community that bridges the gap, is hard work. First of all, it comes to me that some people think that I feel passionately and committed to this, and that somehow my children had something to do with those changes in the congregations that I serve. And that's entirely not true. I had this passion before I adopted my 3 children, who are all people of color. And my children were never participants in the congregations I served. I predated them in ministry, and then later in life they belonged to my wife's congregations. So that having been said, there are some strategies that one can employ. First of all, you have to know who your neighbor is. You have to be able to know the community, not just anecdotally, but out in the community. And for some people that's door knocking, which I think is effective, but it's not everyone's gift. For some people, it's connecting with community organizations and sort of the touchstone places in the community: schools, senior centers, rec centers, police partnerships. But being out in the neighborhood enough to know, who is my neighbor? Who's hiding behind those doors? One of the things that surprised me in my last congregation is that in our neighborhood there is a large concentration of people from Nigeria. And how did we find that out? A very humble pastor came and said, I would like to be able to use your church for prayer with some of my Nigerian sisters and brothers who live in the community. So we opened for him the chapel at our church, which had 35 seats. And the first time they gathered, there was a few people, and the second time it was a little fuller. By the third time they had outgrown the chapel. So then we opened up the main sanctuary with 200 seats. And sure enough, it was the same story again. And it started to grow, and it started to grow, and it started to grow. And one time I went in for an overnight vigil, and there were 600 people, 50% of whom walked to our church.
Wow.
I had no idea. So all of that having been said, it became a ministry of hospitality, and then that hospitality started to bridge the gap because this church would gather once a month, and so we started being more intentional and invitational. And then we had to train our congregations to recognize that when people of color came to a very Anglo congregation, there had to be a different way of seeing one another. You can't just be colorblind. You have to recognize that this is someone who had the courage to come through the door. Not only did they have the courage to come through the door, but then on the other side of the door, they have found themselves in a very significant minority position. Again. And all of those things put together means that we have to be especially diligent to be sensitive, welcoming, without being smothering and overwhelming. That is, I'll never forget the first time a person of color walked into the first congregation I served in our synod. Her name was Miss Tyler, and she came in, and we had just done a whole prayer ministry around, Lord, break down the walls between us and our community. We got together and prayed just like Joshua and Jericho for 7 days around the walls of our church. We went from entrance to entrance praying, and on the seventh day we went around 7 times. And no one was more surprised than me when a person of color walked in the next Sunday. And I'll never forget, I saw her coming up the steps, and she was dressed in beautiful African dress. I later found out she was from Liberia, and she was coming up the steps, and I saw an older gentleman who was the head usher walking over to hand her a bulletin, and I thought, no, don't say something awful. And I was dignified and walking down the aisle and as fast as I could, and I got there, and I heard him say, welcome to Peace Church, we're so glad you're here. Are you a newcomer? And I thought, yes, someone got it, they did it. And she introduced herself, and he said, are you sure you're not looking for John Wesley Church down the block, which of course was the historic black church in Glen Burnie? And I am so thankful to this day that Miss Tyler turned to that gentleman and said, honey, I've been Lutheran longer than you've been out of dice. And she went on then to share the story that she had been part of the Lutheran Church in Liberia, and then she moved to this country to find better paying work to support her family in Liberia. And she became a part of our community. And then after a while, she started inviting friends and family, and other people started to come. And we were intentional about trying to make sure that when we had preachers, special preachers and guest preachers, that we had people of color, people with different multicultural voices in the pulpit. We had tent revivals out on the front lawn of the congregation so that people could come and see that something was changing without trying to get them into our little stained glass fortress. I think that the congregations in our synod, when we talk about grace, need to err on that side of grace and to think very carefully about what it is that people who are new, what it is they see when they come in. Does any of the art reflect something other than a European culture? Does the worship incorporate anything of the cultures of the neighborhood around the church? Are there signs of any sense of multiculturalism? Whether it has to do with missions and missionaries and global mission and ministry, or local mission and ministry. Do we make the ask in the places where we meet our neighbors? Do we have the tools in the hands of our congregants to make the invitation to come and see? Over the years, it's been a lot of trial and error, and things that worked in Glen Burnie didn't work in Baltimore. And things that worked at interim pastorates on North Avenue didn't work at interim pastorates at City Hall Plaza. But in all of those cases, we named what it was that was missing. We talked openly about the barriers that were created by our own sense of culture and propriety. And we did the intentional hard work of talking about a subject that a lot of people don't want to talk about, which is racism. Overtly or passively, the church is fraught with signs of racism. And those things must be overcome. You can't wait for people of color to come into the church and teach us how to be welcoming, how to be loving. We have to do that work largely as Anglo folk to be ready to welcome our neighbor in. So ultimately, I think what I could point to is that there was prayerfulness, there was deliberateness, there was a considerable amount of Bible study and conversation, and then there was a deliberate decision that we were going to do whatever it took to make sure that people of color in our neighborhood, different ethnic communities, were represented in every facet of the church's life. In the choir, in the Sunday school, on the congregation council, in the leadership, at every level of the church. We had seminary interns that we intentionally sought after because they were people of color. We had field education students that were people of color. We intentionally hired young people from the neighborhood to do different things in the life of the church, so that we were lifting up people of color, so that we started to become the community that we always dreamed and knew that God was calling us to become. We were rich and heady times. And boy, did we screw up a long time and a lot of times along the way. Unfortunately, God blessed us with folk who would correct us very gently and say, no, that's not how we do things.
Like Miss Tyler. Yeah.
Like Miss Tyler. But others who came after her. Because we also have to remember, even as we become a more multicultural community, my experience as a middle-aged white man is a different experience than any person of color, and I will never fully understand that experience. And we must be vigilant about never usurping someone else's experience or appropriating it as their struggle as our own. Ultimately, the guiding principle was, I never wanted our congregations to be a voice for the voiceless. I wanted them to be a place where marginalized voices could find their voice, their testimony and witness, and help shape the church and its ministry for life in the world.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I personally have a lot of things to think and reflect on that, and I appreciate you doing that for those who listen.
Thank you, Pastor. It's good to be with you as always.
God bless.